Hey, I'm Jonathan Herrera, and I am coming to you today from my studio in Oakland, Dime, on behalf of Bass Magazine. Bass Magazine is the online publication from the former staff of Bass Player Magazine, of which I was a longtime member. So people like Chris Gisi, John Diaria, Elton Bradman, and myself moved our experience and expertise and philosophy online to bassmagazine.com. And it's our intention that that be as deep and comprehensive a resource as Bass Player was. So if you haven't checked it out yet, please do. Um, but the purpose of my being here today is not to pitch that to you. It is to introduce you to the Boss OC-5, which I'm sure if you're into pedals at all is a very exciting piece of news. It's not often that Boss comes out with an update to its venerable octave pedal. In fact, there's only been one historically. However, as of yesterday, I am allowed to tell you that I am in possession of an OC-5. And so I know you're anxious to hear it, and we're definitely going to go through it. But I want to give you a little bit of background on how we arrived at OC-5 and maybe a theory as to why we skipped 4. So, for some context, the OC-2 was originally released in 1982 and quickly became the definitive octave pedal. I believe there were some other options at the time, but no pedal tracked as well, sounded as good, was as convenient, as easy to fit into a pedal board, all the things that make that Boss pedal format and have made Boss such an important brand for pedals were true of the octave. And it's kind of like a must have for bass players to some degree, although there's definitely since then been a lot of competition. If you're into the OC2 and you're geeked on the OC2, you're like my buddy Yannick, and you have, I don't know, he has over a dozen, I think. You know that there were multiple versions. There was the original, which was called the Octaver, and it was a dark brown color. And then there was a lighter brown color, and it dropped the R, and it became just the octave. And at some point in there, the chip that they used to do the octave conversion changed, and then they moved production from Japan to Taiwan. And these are the kinds of things that keep pedal geeks up at night. However, regardless of the iteration, they all sound pretty close. And the reason they're so popular is, like I said, they sound good and they work, they track well, they do all the things, particularly for bass players, that we want out of an octave. And so, what is it we want out of an octave? At this point, I think that most players want two things out of an octave. They want a really good doubled dry signal octave sound, something that, just to thicken your sound, like you might have heard Pino Palladino do back in the 80s with artists like Paul Young, where he was playing his fretless Stingray and he had that lower octave supporting it. Or you want to duplicate or emulate the sound of a synthesizer, a concept that I believe Jojo Mayer, the great drummer, introduced to various bass players that kind of came through his band and then became a kind of a popular, kind of almost like an accidental use of the OC2, which was to turn the direct signal down all the way and turn the octave one octave down signal all the way up, and thus you have no dry signal and only the synthesized octave signal. And that actually gets you a pretty authentic sounding synth tone. The reason being is that an analog octave pedal like the OC2, in order for it to work, it produces a square wave from the input signal. And a square wave, as you may know, is one of the primary waveforms that an analog synthesizer offers you. So it's kind of like a hack to achieve, to really turn your bass into a synth. There's some filtration on it in the pedal, so it's not as edgy as a pure square wave. And then you might combine that with other stuff, maybe an envelope filter or whatever, fuzz pedal, and get close to like a key bass sound, which a lot of us bass players do when we want to cop Bernie Worrell grooves or Stevie Wonder grooves or whatever. So those are kind of the two primary uses that I've encountered of the OC2. And things are going along great. And then Boss in the early 2000s released the first update to the OC2, the OC3, and this is like 20 years after the OC2. They actually discontinued the OC2, immediately making them collectible. And I remember when you could pick one up in a used music shop for like $35, and all of a sudden that was doubling and tripling. Nevertheless, they released this new pedal in the OC-3, and it was nowhere near as popular as the OC-2, and despite doing more. And why? Because it was digital. So unlike an analog octave like the OC-2, which uses a little simple device called a flip-flop, which kind of counts the frequency of the input and halves it and spits out a square wave, the OC-3 takes your input signal, which is in the analog domain, uses an A to D converter, analog to digital converter, turns it into zeros and ones, processes it, does the octave doubling and other features, turns it back into analog and spits it out. The result of this is a better feature set than the OC-2. It's not arguable, but there is something lost to most people's ears in this transition in terms of tone, in terms of sound. However, there are things gained because in the digital environment, once your signal is converted to digital, you can do all kinds of stuff to it. Just as I'm sure anyone who's ever played around in a DAW like Logic or Pro Tools will attest. I mean, you can manipulate sound in so many more complex ways once it's digital. And so the OC-3 enabled polyphony. It enabled all kinds of cool stuff that the OC-2 did not. Okay, so now we have the OC-5, which just came out a few days ago. Why 5? I think the number 5, OC-5, suggests kind of the basic sort of mission brief, design principle of this pedal, which was to combine the OC-2 and the OC-3, 2 plus 3 equals 5, into one thing. And it achieves that by having two settings which completely change the sound and function of the pedal. There is a vintage setting and a poly setting. You could almost think of these two settings as OC-2 and OC-3. So I know you're anxious to hear it. I'm anxious for you to hear it as well. But real quick, I'm going to walk you through the features of this pedal, and you'll see why it is really just like a cocktail that combines the OC-2 and the OC-3. So here you have your direct level. That's the dry signal. Actually, first off, let me tell you about the I/O, how stuff gets in and out of this, because that is also different. One input, that's different from the OC-3. The OC-3 had two, one for guitar, one for bass. This does have a switch which governs this input and makes it more appropriate for guitar or bass. However, that's on the back here. You have to take my word for it. So instead of two jacks, you just have a switch here. And then you have these two outputs. This is very cool. The output, it just says output, is the combined signal. This would be your direct signal plus whatever octave functionality you've engaged with these knobs. Direct out is just your dry signal. And when something is plugged into the direct out, the output becomes the octave effects. So you have now split your signal into dry and wet, essentially. And this would be pretty cool live. Let's say you have two amps. One is kind of set up for the octave. One set up for your dry tone. Let's say you're in the studio. You want to split there's all kinds of interesting ways you could use this. And that's groovy. So moving past the getting in and out of it, let's talk about what the stuff does. So we have a direct level. That is how loud the dry signal is, your bass's signal. The +1 octave. So here immediately we're kind of out of familiar territory. This adds an octave up. And because of the way that analog octaves work, you can't really create an authentic octave up sound in the analog domain. You can fake it, sort of, to some degree, by distorting it with emphasis on the first harmonic, which is one octave up. But that's not really like a true doubling effect. And this does enable that. But the way it enables that is digitally. Interestingly, this is actually still engaged even if you're in the OC-2 setting. So we'll hear what that sounds like later. And so the amount of the octave up is on this knob. We also have octave down. So this is the level of the one octave down setting. And we have a knob here which does two different things depending what setting you're in. If you're in the vintage setting, this is the second octave, so 2 octave down, the level of the 2 octave down signal. So if you're in vintage, you can think of this knob, and this knob, as being essentially an OC2, because that's what an OC2 offers you. A direct level, 1 octave down, 2 octave down levels. If this switch is in poly mode, this changes, the function of it changes. Now it engages this cool new setting. So obviously it suggests, by virtue of the name here, the poly mode is polyphonic. So instead of an analog octave where if you input 2 notes, it starts to hunt and warble because it can't process 2 notes. In poly mode, it will offer octave doubling of all of the notes you play. However, with this knob, depending on the setting of it, it will limit the range of the octave effect to just the lowest notes in your chord. Let's say you're playing polyphonically, you're playing a chord. So when this is in its lowest setting, only the lowest note of your chord is going to be doubled. Everything above that will be sent through direct. And where that cutoff of that change in between just the direct signal and the doubled signal occurs is where this knob is. So this is sort of like a threshold for the octave effect. Okay, cool. Well, I'm sure you want to hear this. I want to play it. So let's start. I'm going to turn it on by pressing like that, just like all boss pedals for time immemorial. Let's just begin with a simple sound. This is going to be in the vintage setting, 1 octave down and the dry, both at about 12 o'clock. Let's hear what that sounds like. Classic. Sounds like an OC2 to me. Great track. Okay, so let's hear how this sounds. First, let's try direct and 1 octave down, both at about 12 o'clock. So this would be kind of like a 50-50 mix of the direct signal and the 1 octave down. Let's hear how that sounds. Tracks really well. And it tracks down into the lower register of the bass, which is pretty impressive. Still there. Still there. None of that like warbly kind of hunting for the note. Cool. All right. That sounds good. Let's try the direct plus 2 octave down in the vintage setting. So that's, put about 12 o'clock. Very subby, obviously. And I have to kind of play high because you can imagine if I play low on the instrument and then we're adding a note 2 octaves below that note, we're, way deep, beyond the cutoff of your speakers, your headphones or whatever. Cool. Very groovy. All right, let's try the sort of Jojo Mayer setting. You might hear folks like Tim LaFave, Steve Jenkins, Yannick, Gwizdala. Lots of people use this setting, myself on many a gig. So we'll turn this off. We're going to turn the octave one all down, one octave down, sorry, all the way up, and we're going to turn the direct off. And so this is kind of our pseudo synth setting. Has that kind of gooey liquid kind of wonkiness that the OC-2 does, right? And then again, the tracking. Not blah, 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 blah. None of that turkey vibe. Goes low. That is cool. Let's try same vibe, but 2 octaves down, soloed. Just crank it, why not? Ooh, deep. Just pure subs. I mean, for like a hip hop kind of. Mute it. So far, I mean, I'm not doing an A to B in real time right now, but I have spent many, 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 many hours with an OC-2 in my life, and this is pretty close. Okay. Oh, another thing I want to show you, which is kind of breaks us out of OC-2 territory, is in the vintage setting, the octave up is still available to you. So this is with the OC-2 style octave down sound, but now we have a digitally derived octave up sound. So let's try that. So I'll bring this octave, lower octave, 1 octave down, back up, and I'm going to add in the octave up. And so now this is kind of interesting because all you're hearing are synthesized sounds. The octave up is derived synthetically, the octave down is, but no direct. So it's kind of like there's a hole in the middle where the direct signal should be. The tracking, again, I'm still totally blown away. You can't really like trick it. That's fun. And I am not the biggest fan, this is just personal, subjective, of octave up sounds. They're quite popular, I think, nowadays, because there's so many ways to achieve it digitally, and it does put the bass up in like the more traditional lead melody register. But I think a lot of those pedals, I don't know, they're just not for me. They kind of have like a bit of a digital, I don't want to say that. Digital's not fair, but they kind of have like a bit of an edginess to them that sounds unnatural to me. And I think this has a bit of that, but it's kind of rounded off. I don't know, they must be doing some filtering. It's not, I don't know, it's not grating in the way some of the other ones are. And let me add it in the direct. So now we have like a 3-layer dip, if you will, of bass. So this is 1 octave down, direct, 1 octave up. NPR. I have a feeling this is going to be the basis of many a give the bass player some moment, if you know what I'm saying. Immediately you're going to go stomp on this and go to town. Again, the tracking is... But, and that kind of revealed it, because it's in the vintage setting and it's the OC-2 style analog derived setting, but the exception of the octave up, it's monophonic, right? So when you try to play 2 notes at the same time, the octave up something weird happens there. You hear the octave down starting to kind of trip out. Now, I'm not entirely sure technically, and I am been trying to get with Roland on this about in this setting, vintage with the octave up. Is this like a hybrid of a digital octave up and an analog octave down? Because you see the octave up kind of hanging in, but you hear the lower octave glitching the moment they're played together. So, anyway, point is, if we want polyphony, we need to go into our poly mode, right? Obviously. So, once I'm there, all of these do the same thing. I mean, not all of them. These two do the same thing. This changes function as I described and as I will play for you. But the octave down now is a digitally generated octave down, like the OC-3. It's essentially the OC-3 octave down, as far as I know. Definitely is digital. And then again, we still have use of our octave up. So let's just hear the poly setting kind of where we started, except, with a dry and just a kind of, general half-half, 50-50 ratio of the octave down and the dry. But this time our octave down is digital. Now, for context, let's hear that against the same setting, but in the OC-2 mode. So the poly mode is definitely louder. And the quality of the octave down is different. It's a little fatter sounding. And I'm not saying that like, we think fat equals good, because that's, pH fat. But it's bigger, it's bassier, but it's kind of, not quite as gooey, if that makes any kind of sense. So there's our vintage. Yeah. And the ratio is changed in favor of the octave down in the poly. Let's hear it soloed. So this would be kind of the poly version of that pseudo synth sound that we know and love from the OC-2. So it's just like pure low. There's very little harmonic information in this. the tracking is great, but the timbre is quite a bit different. Let me A/B it against the vintage. There's that kind of slightly kind of honky, kind of, funky, I guess is the word in the true sense of the word, OC-2 sound against the poly digital soloed octave. And I had to be careful with this one because I don't want to clip my preamp. Okay, so let's further explore the poly mode. So obviously poly mode, what it suggests, one of the cool features is, let me get some direct back in there, and I'll add in some of the octave up. And now I should be able to actually, let me make sure this is turned up. Hold on. So now the octave is not glitching out, and I am playing multiple notes. Here's 4 at the same time. Let's try it with the octave down out completely. So now we have something we might use, for some chordal stuff, maybe with some delay and reverb and vibey stuff like that. Let's try tenths, You can get pretty spicy with the dissonances in there, and it still kind of holds together. I mean, it's edgy, but... So let's turn the direct off, see how just the soloed octave up sounds. I hear a little bit of there's like a little envelope on the front of that, like a little timbre change immediately on the attack. I wonder what that is. Wow, that's fun. You know how it is, like we don't get to go up there very often. So if I have the poly mode engaged, this now, as I said, controls how much of what I'm playing gets the octave down treatment. So turn the direct back up. So right now in this particular setting with this bass and this position on the neck, all of those notes are getting doubled. If I turn this down all the way, theoretically, only the lowest of these, let me play a different voicing, should be getting the octave down. So let's test that. Let me take the octave up out so it's a little confusing. thinks. You know, so that should be all the notes. If I turn this down, the top one should not be. I don't know about that. I'm not quite getting this to work. We're in poly. You know, I can kind of, if I play one note. Okay, so none of those are being doubled. But if I got lower, that's starting to get doubled. And just moving this a little tiny bit. Maybe I have to play a chord. I don't know. You know, I think that this setting in the poly mode where you're changing what range the octave effect, the octave down effect is sensitive to is something that's going to depend a lot on the source, on your bass, on where on the bass. I'm sure the timbre of the bass, so the kind of harmonic content of it. All of these variables, I imagine, are going to govern where this is effective. As it's kind of set up, it's just sort of... Yeah, it's not very predictable the way it works. And that, you know, obviously I just got this, so I want to, you know, acknowledge that it could be something that there's a learning curve for. But as it is, I mean, I'm not quite getting it to do what it says. Anyway, that's probably not the most important feature of this pedal anyway. The most important feature of this pedal is that you have an OC-2, a new OC-2 of sorts, OC-2 sound that you can buy now, which is better than needing to find a vintage pedal out there. And that same pedal that offers you that OC-2 sound also has polyphony. It has an octave up. You can do octave up with no dry signal, you know, for solo stuff or looping or you know, there's just a lot of opportunity here sonically in a pedal that costs $129 as far as I know at the moment. So that's pretty exciting. You know, I think it's pretty successful. You know, there's probably spending more time with it's going to be rewarding, getting into the different outputs and processing those two signals differently. I mean, there's a lot there, I'm sure, which I will explore down the road. But as it is, if you don't have an octave pedal yet, or you're like me and you have a bunch and you're just always looking for something new and cool, this definitely seems to check all the boxes. As far as I know, there's no other pedal out there that's a hybrid sort of cocktail of an analog and a digital. So for that reason alone, I think it's worth checking out the OC-5. Thanks very much. Appreciate your time. I'll talk soon. Now I'm going to play a little line and reamp it through an OC-2, an OC-3, and an OC-5 and see how they stack up.